Hello, everybody. I have with me today Bernardo Kastrup. We're going to be talking about free will. It's something that I've been talking about a bit on this channel recently, and it's something that he has been talking about for a while, I think, and has recently put out an essay at Essentia Foundation and has been talking a bit about it on his YouTube channel. So let's find out where we agree, where we disagree, and go from there, shall we?
Sure.
So, yes, could you sort of summarize to us your overall views on free will?
I think if we understand free will under physicalist premises, and that's the notion that your choices are not determined by patterns of brain activity. If that's how we define free will, I think we do have free will, because I don't think our conscious inner life is determined or produced or generated by patterns of brain activity. I think patterns of brain activity are what our conscious inner life looks like when observed from the outside. Matter, in my view, is the outside appearance of mental processes. But of course, that's a very limited way to define free will. It comes down to the notion of, is everything predetermined, in the sense that everything is given by the fundamental organizing principles of nature, so black holes and galaxies, but also human choices. Well, then I think, yes, things are determined by natural laws. But I don't think that violates our intuition of free will, because I think free will is an incoherent notion. I think what we intuit by it is that if we have free-willed choices, then our choices cannot be determined. Otherwise, it's not free. But they can also not be random. Otherwise, it's not will. But things are either determined or random. And even randomness may be a merely epistemic notion. It may be just, well, we don't know the cause. So I think things are determined, but I think the universe is computationally irreducible. In other words, we can't predict the fine details of what's going to happen. There are just too many variables. The system is chaotic, so a slight deviation in your input assumptions or measurements leads to completely different outcomes. So I don't think the universe as a whole, I don't think God can predict the future. The only way to know is to get there, is to let time run, allow us to get there, and then we will know. It's determined, but it cannot be known in advance. In other words, everything happens as though our choices were really free, because every choice is a moment of self-discovery. It's that moment of, oh, I am the agent who makes this choice under these circumstances. So I think the meaning of the whole thing of life is this self-discovery. Not that you make choices that could have been otherwise. I don't think there is any could have been.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So that, from what I've read, is sort of the first half of your free will position, right? And then you have sort of this other view about the perspective from mind at large. So maybe we'll look at that stuff later. So,
okay.
So let me just get straight what you're saying about things from our level, that everything that happens is either determined or random. And so, but that determination is not material, as a physicalist might have it. So it's not from our mind, not from our brain, because anyone who's followed your work at all realize that brains are what minds look like, rather than the other way around. And so even though the future is determined, and it would need to be determined for us to be free, it's what was the bit about how that would still be free will?
Yeah. If we abandon the untenable definition that free will is that thing that exists in between randomness and determination, well, there's nothing in between, then a more mature definition would be, my choices are free if they are determined by me, by that which I identify with. And none of us identifies with patterns of brain activity in our heads because we have no access to them. We identify with our desires, with our preferences, with our dispositions. That's what we identify with. And I think our choices are determined by those. They are determined by that which we are. In other words, our conscious inner life with all its biases, preferences, and tastes, and so on, fears and loves. So from that perspective, if we define free will that way, we all have free will because our choices are determined largely by that which we identify with, our conscious inner life. But if you look one layer deeper, is that really free will? Because can we be other than what we are? Could we have other dispositions and desires and tastes than what we have? I submit to you that we couldn't. We are what we are, and we can't be otherwise. So if our choices are determined by us, but we can't escape us, are our choices really free? I mean, Schopenhauer put it in one of his wonderful short statements. He said, I'll paraphrase, I don't remember the exact words, it depends on the translation as well, but he said something like, we are free to choose as we will, but we aren't free to will what we will. We will what we do because we are what we are, and it can't be otherwise. So a choice, again, is a moment of self-discovery. We discover what we are. We are that which makes a choice under certain circumstances.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the sort of more Hobbesian view of free will, that your will is free if you're doing what you want, or something that, I mean, maybe what you can as identify with is broader than wants, is it? Or is it predominantly something like wants and beliefs?
Yes, but your wants and beliefs can be ego-centered or not. There are people who genuinely want the best for a collective. And then they still choose according to that bias, to that desire, to that disposition. And they identify with that. So in that sense, their choices are free because it's determined by that which they identify with. But they couldn't choose otherwise because they couldn't be other than what they are.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So
Otherwise, Nathan, otherwise we would all be maximally happy. We just would need to choose to will precisely the circumstances in which we find ourselves, whatever they are. And we would all be maximally happy. Even if you're serving serving a life sentence in solitary confinement, you would choose that that's what you really, really, really want. Well, nobody can do that. So,
yeah. So I remember reading things along those lines. So there's probably about 3 or 4 different areas from what you said so far that I think I would like to discuss further with you.
sure.
So I've written something down. Let's start with this idea of determined or random. So when you say that there's a dichotomy between determined and random, do you mean causally determined, or are you working with a slightly broader notion of determined?
I think causation is also an appearance. I think because it depends on time. Causation is a cause happening now and an effect happening at some point, delta t later. And I don't think time is fundamental. So therefore, I don't think causation is fundamental. I think reality as it is in itself is what I call the crystal of eternity. It's a web of semantic associations. It's a pattern that exists. I'm tempted to say all at once, but if I say that, I'm already postulating time. Alan Watts had the best metaphor for that. He said, suppose you're sitting in front of a fence, a wooden fence, and there is a slit in the fence where the panels don't touch well. So you can only see the other side of the fence through the slit. Then a cat walks on the other side and passes along the slit. So you see the head of the cat and then the cat's tail. And then at some point later, the cat turns around and walks back and passes through the slit again. And again, you see the head and then the tail. So you would at some point say, well, the head causes the tail. Well, yes, in a sense, if you're traversing time through the slit of the moment, but the true reality is there is only the whole pattern at once. It's the cat. So I think causation is like that. It's our watching reality through the slit of the now. But I think everything exists at once. So I don't think causation is fundamental, but it does reveal the pattern of reality. So from that perspective, if things are determined by the underlying pattern of reality, then they are determined, really. Even if you don't believe in causation as fundamental, it's still a reflection of the true underlying pattern of reality.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds to me then that that's sort of a Humean notion of causation, that it's patterns in what occurs, that certain things occur, because presumably, if depending on how seriously we take the dog metaphor, the reason that we wouldn't think the nose causes the head causes the back is because we think the causal relation at play is that the running of the dog causes us to perceive nose followed by head followed by back and so on. And the dog could at some point turn around and not fully go through, and so there's no necessity there between what we're perceiving.
There's a limit to every metaphor. Yeah. In this case, what really makes us think of causation is the slit. Because if there were no slit, if there were no fence, you would always see the dog or the cat, the whole thing, and you wouldn't mistake it. It's the slit, the limitation of the now, our inability to perceive past and future, that generates this notion of causation. But I think reality is one semantic pattern. It's one web of semantic associations.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that sort of stuff, we can maybe pick up a bit more when we talk about how you understand free will at the level of mind at large. But let me just stop. So you said at one point there's no semantic gap between determined and random, but I don't see that. It seems to me that if we took free will seriously, we would think that you could get things that are determined, and then there are things that are random, and then there are things that are chosen. Because, I mean, random doesn't mean simply not determined. It means sort of disconnected from what went before, or at least not entailed by what went before. We could understand that logically. If we say Descartes or something, we want to sort of think there's this sort of rational principle at work that leads from one time to the other. We could maybe understand it empirically and just as in constant conjunction, but then that kind of pulls apart the necessity that we think is involved, which seems to give space for free will. But then there's also another possibility between determined and random, which when I read your essay, you appealed to later on, which is the idea that it just being, that it just is, that there just is event A followed by event B followed by event C. There is no determinism going on there. There's no sort of connection between the events. They merely are. Not random, but not determined.
You could say there is only the crystal of eternity. It is what it is, and it merely is. But if you traverse the crystal of eternity through a slit, it will to a large extent look like causal determinism, because the crystal has a certain intrinsic pattern that manifests as regularities through the slit, and to the extent that we can identify those regularities, we can speak of determinism. Fundamentally, though, everything classical we think of today as determined. For instance, the throw of a coin, which is what we use as random. Well, it's not random. It's whether the coin will fall face down or up is entirely determined by the size of the coin, its geometry, where its center of mass is, the weight distribution, air currents, how the wind is looking like, atmospheric pressure, the height of the fall, and all that. It's just that it's too much for us to take into consideration. So in practice, we can't make the prediction, and we call it random. In other words, randomness becomes a epistemic definition. If we can't predict it, we say it's random, which doesn't mean that it is fundamentally random. There's only one thing in physics today for which the jury is still out, whether it's fundamentally random or not, and that is the outcome of microscopic quantum events. But I would argue that, again, that's merely an epistemic limitation. I mean, we, bipedal apes, haven't managed to come up yet with a way to predict the outcome of a single quantum event, single quantum observations. We can only predict laws of large numbers. In other words, the statistical distribution. That doesn't mean that nature is actually fundamentally random at that microscopic level. As a matter of fact, it cannot be, because if it really were, it's hard to see how order could emerge at higher levels if at the bottom everything truly is random, that we can predict the statistical distribution of single quantum events sort of betrays that they aren't really random. But yeah, I acknowledge that the jury is still out. Can we truly make predictions beyond laws of large numbers at the microscopic level? I don't know. I tend to think that it's merely our knowledge and prediction limitation. We are apes. Why would apes be able to predict everything? But that doesn't mean that things aren't actually determined very fundamentally by what the universe is.
Yeah, so I think you can take this leap of faith and just say that in things as themselves are determined. But it seems to me that you're, on the one hand, sort of saying that everything is already predetermined. That's maybe not the right word to use, but everything's sort of, you're hedging your language, and I understand why, saying that it's sort of all at once, in which case we just have this Humean conception of the world of space-time filled with its events and properties, and all we think of as causal laws or deterministic laws are patterns that successfully describe that which is indeed the case. Sort of, you have events first and then laws coming second. But that view then doesn't suggest that there is causation in things themselves, out in the metaphysical stuff, that it's descriptive. There are patterns in the metaphysical stuff, but without those interrelations of connection and causation and so on. So in that case, we have the way it looks like it's causal, like you said, the dog. It looks causal. Sorry, the dog or the cat or something. So it looks causal. So I'm going to agree with you that I think reality looks causal. But it could look causal without being causal. And that would normally be the Humean position, as far as I take it.
Yeah.
Right? So it looks causal because, I can't go back time and choose something else. And if we can give an account of what I in fact did, but that doesn't mean there wasn't any sort of wiggle room, that things couldn't have been otherwise. So there seems to be this gap between determined or random without it having to be random. So you could say it's just a brute fact, or you could say that it's chosen. And I think both of those are definitely in the semantic space between determined and random.
Yeah, I finally understand. Sorry about my thickness. I finally understand where you're going with this. My position is more subtle than I think most listeners would take it to be right now. I do not believe in the notion that the universe is causally closed at the physical level, because what you're saying is that there isn't necessarily any fundamental organizing principle that inheres in physical stuff and determines the next state of the universe. There is just a given. There is a next state of the universe. And in hindsight, we abstract certain regularities in this succession of things that simply are. It doesn't mean that there is a built-in organizing principle in the physical stuff we observe. So my position is compatible with that, but it gives still a deterministic account. And then let me share with you why. I think physical stuff is appearance. It's the way mental processes out there in the real world, in nature, look like when we observe them. Let me go back to my favorite metaphor of the dashboard. Physical stuff is what appears on your internal dashboard. In other words, the screen of your perception, because like an airplane, you have sensors that measure the real states of the world. Those states are presented to you in the form of a dashboard that evolved for fitness reasons, not to show you the world as it is, but to show you the world in the best way to allow you to react to environmental challenges and opportunities as quickly and optimally as possible. What we call physical causation is the following. Imagine that there are two dials in your dashboard, say air pressure and air humidity. And you have those two dials there with their needles moving. just like when you look at the cat passing across the fence, on the other side of the fence, suppose that every time you see the dial showing air pressure going down, a little while later, the dial showing air humidity goes up. Because that's what happens, right? When air pressure goes down, you suck in air humidity and cause precipitation. But you don't see the sky. All you have is the dashboard. All we have is the physical world. We don't get to see the world as it actually is. So every time we see one dial going down, we see the other going up a little while later. And we say, the movement of this dial caused the movement of the other dial. That's physical causation, in my view. In other words, it's not true causation. It's a consequence of true causation. Air pressure out there in the sky sucked in air humidity. That's the actual causal chain. And that causal chain appears to us as dial movements, and we mistake the correlations between dial movements, we mistake that for the actual causation. No, it's just a proxy for it. It's a proxy for causation. Now, the consequence of this is that there is no reason to think that you have all the dials on your dashboard that you need to discern everything that is salient about the world. In other words, the physical world doesn't need to be complete. It doesn't need to represent or show us all the nuances and subtleties of the actual chains of causation. It stands to reason that a lot is left out. Why would we evolve to pick out everything that is salient for philosophy? We evolved to pick out what is salient for survival, not for high-level primate thinking. So I do not think the physical universe is causally closed. It would be fantastic if it were so, because it would mean that your dashboard is so complete that all causal chains unfolding out there correlate with these dials moving on your dashboard. There's absolutely no reason to think that is the case. Therefore, insofar as I claim that all physical phenomena and all physical entities are mere representations, indeed, there are no organizing principles that inhere in them. In the same way that there are no organizing principles that inhere in the dials of your dashboard. The organizing principles play out in the sky outside. The dashboard is a proxy for it. So in that sense, I go along with this view. But I also say that in the actual world, behind the dashboard, the thing that is being represented by the dashboard, there are organizing principles that do inhere. It's not mere chance. It is just a partial view of the crystal of eternity as can be discerned in the slit of the moment.
So that doesn't sound too different, really, to me, to the scientific realist position. I mean, they're not going to say that, well, so there's one sort of notion of cause that we have as an everyday sense, you know, that me knocking over the wine glass caused it to spill. But the scientific account is going to be far more complicated than that. It's going to involve things that we can't observe. They would still call them physical, but they're effectively theoretical entities that we can calculate. So it sounds to me as though you would want to say they're mental things, but there is this sort of, we've got the world that we experience, the world of appearance or the dashboard, and then there's a world of reality behind it. So this is back to those same debates that play out with Berkeley and in his day, and then now Michael Peltzar has these same arguments, and the arguments for normally the idealist is not you. Normally the idealist is saying that, well, we can see that there's regularity in our experiences of the world, and the person who wants to say that there's this other reality underlying that, typically they think of it in material terms, but you're thinking of it in mental terms. They say there must be some other underlying reality that is producing this regularity that we experience to the degree that we experience it. And it's that underlying reality that is governed by laws or causal relations of necessity. And that explains the reality we experience, whether in our everyday idea understanding or on the dashboard. And then normally at this point, the idealist pushes back and says, well, okay, I have to explain the regularity of experience, but why take this unnecessary detour to say the regularity of experience is caused by some deeper kind of regularity or causal connections at this other level of reality underneath, and we're just seeing the surface of it, I can just say that the regularity is just a regularity of experience itself, a regularity on the dashboard, without needing to push it back. Now, so there's that question, but even so there's that. But then also, again, it still seems to me as though we've just got this epistemic notion of causation. I guess that's the one you're saying on the dashboard, isn't it? The kind of more pragmatist. Yeah. So
yeah, one diode doesn't cause the other. They are both caused by a third thing, so it looks like one causes the other.
Yeah. So effectively, you're saying that mind at large has genuine causal connections between its excitations. And those excitations that have a genuine causal connection, necessary causal connection?
I think mind at large has a structure, a cognitive structure, that appears to us as genuine causal connections. And I think this is an inevitable thing, because to be is to have properties. You are what you are and not something else you could conceivably be. So mind at large, outside time, I mean, even physics is doing away with time as a fundamental thing these days. Loop quantum gravity and all that stuff, time becomes an emergent property of microscopic level quantum processes. So if you do away with time, we have to qualify causation. Causation is an appearance of an underlying structure, because causation only exists in time. Without time, there's no causation, there's only structure. I go one step further and I say that structure is cognitive. It's a semantic structure. So if mind at large is, it must be what it is, as opposed to something else it could have been. In other words, it must have the cognitive structure it has, as opposed to some other cognitive structure it could have had. And that cognitive structure that is and isn't something else will inevitably be perceived through the slit. As we run this slit through the crystal of eternity, it will inevitably be perceived as certain regularities that we can then genuinely call causal connections.
Yeah, okay. So I think maybe my view is that there is determinism. I mean, let's put the potential randomness of half-life decay or whatever and some of the other quantum things to the side. So let's, for the sake of, I don't know enough of the science to argue it, but let's say it is purely epistemic. Okay. Russell has this good paper on the notion of cause. I don't know if you've read it. But he says that the fact that reality is determined mathematically is trivial, because you could have your mathematical functions as gerrymandered as you like, right? You just have to define it differently over different bands and so on. Now, what physics tries to do is it tries to find the most sort of elegant and simplistic forms of mathematical determinism. And he says that physics and the hard sciences have abandoned causal explanations long ago because they have all these issues and problems. What counts as a cause, what doesn't, how do we separate out conditions from causes, and so on. Collingwood goes further and says that actually the notion of them being sequential in time but also necessitating them ends up contradictory, and I think he's right on that. So Russell says that you definitely have determinism, the kind of determinism that you should accept if you're taking science seriously is a mathematical determinism. But that gives you the thing you're talking about. It gives you this sort of crystalline, kind of almost logical structure of interconnections. As far as I'm concerned, you can accept that and leave the free will question completely alone for a couple of reasons. So first of all, as you say, in that kind of structure, you have no absolute arrow of time. There is no sort of temporal direction. And so it's no more true to say that my decision to do X at time t was caused by the state of the universe at time t minus 1, or determined, I should say, by the time at time t minus 1, than my decision right now determines the state of the universe at t minus 1.
Correct.
There is no particular priority of the past to the present. And similarly, we can think of that determinism running backwards as well. It's not causal, so there's nothing strange. And you can run classical mechanics either direction you like when you're calculating the states of a system. In which case, then, there is nothing at all strange, I think, about having a kind of intentional notion of determinism. What determined me to do this? The fact that in 10 minutes' time, I wanted to talk to Bernardo. That's what got me to come up to the computer and turn it on and log in. So there was this backwards determinism, which is, I think, far more in keeping with our subjective experience of the world. So we can have determinism in that way, as this crystalline structure. But that doesn't impose on free will if we don't think of there being something causal which prioritizes the past over the present. In which case, then, you have this other notion of cause, which is interestingly the one that Collingwood is pointing to, and I think Russell thinks is a bit of a layover in science, that people still talk as though gravity causes the planets to orbit the sun. And that language is pretty shoddy. It's in mathematics. Force doesn't cause mass times acceleration. It's just quantitatively equal to it, and F equals ma and so on. So mathematics isn't about causing. There's no priority involved. So then when we're thinking about free will, the causal understanding we have there, so says Collingwood, and it's not just him, even Price and Menzies, when they're explaining causation, they think that our causal concept arises from our experience of agency. That we experience a connection between our intentions and our actions and the results of those actions. So we use causal reasoning in order to get what we want, what's called means-end causation. That I wanted to have a conversation with you and I deliberated about the best way to have that. It would involve sending you emails, picking a topic and coming online and everything. So there is this causation, but when we reason causally, we take our decisions to be uncaused. That these are the start. I've got 6 possibilities in front of me. And now I think, suppose I choose option A, I treat that as an uncaused cause, and then I reason causally from then and figure out which of those would achieve my ends. And so I think the video that I put out, which I think is correct, is that actually the only concept of causation that is coherent is one which intimately ties together with our deliberation for action. And the kind of relation that you need scientifically in the hard sciences, because obviously other sciences use cause because they're a lot looser in the way they explain things, is something more like mathematical determinism, which should probably be considered more along the lines of a Leibnizian principle of sufficient reason, that we can provide an explanation or a reason for events to be thus and so. But there is no notion of priority, of causing, which, because it's so tied to our experience of choosing to act for reasons, makes us feel like somehow we're being forced to do what we do. Or, I think some people say it's like the laws of physics, take the earth by the ears and march it around the sun. This sort of idea of compulsive law from the laws of physics. So I think if you say that, which I think is correct, you have everything you need for a libertarian view of free will. In that I could have done otherwise, because could have done otherwise reasoning is intimately connected to our capacity to deliberate.
I agreed with you all the way until the last statement that we could have a libertarian view of free will. Look, what you discussed before is required by the view that reality is outside time. It's just a pattern, in my view, a pattern of cognitive associations. It simply is what it is. And we talk about the cause of priority of the past because we happened to be moving with our slit of the now in a certain direction. And we have access to the past, but we don't have access to the future. So we prioritize the data we do have over the data we don't have, the latter we try to predict. But if the cat would walk on the other side of the fence backwards, we would say the tail causes the head. And that is equally valid as to say that the head causes the tail, because in both cases you're describing the pattern, the cat, in an adequate way, equally adequate way, or equally inadequate way. So there is no priority of the past. I'm completely comfortable with that. It's an implication of my view. But notice, now, why do I not think that this leads to libertarian free will? For the following reason. We too are part of nature. We are not abstract observers that are sticking our heads inside an aquarium and observing what's going on. No, we are in the aquarium. We are part of the aquarium. We are part of nature. We rose out of nature and we are going to be reabsorbed into nature. We are nature. We are segments of nature. So we too are part of the crystal of eternity. That is what it is and not something else it could have conceivably been. So there is no could have been. There is no I could have made a different choice, because the crystal of eternity couldn't have been other than what it is. It is what it is. You see? So even if you don't give priority to the past, even if you understand causation as a convenient way to think about reality, which is what I think, it's convenient to say the movement of one dial causes the movement of the other. It's not true. It's convenient. So causation is convenient. It's not true. But the underlying pattern is what it is. And therefore, there is no could have been. The past is what it is, just as the future is what it is, just as the now is what it is, because there is only the crystal of eternity with the regularities and patterns that it has, and not other regularities and patterns.
Yeah, okay. So, as you know, sure, I'm going to come back on that a little bit. So, I think in one sense, what you're saying is trivial, right? We can say what has been, what is, what will be, right?
So in what sense could you say it could have been different? In what sense is that true?
Well, I mean, you either think modal reasoning is entirely illegitimate, or you think that modal reasoning has some legitimacy. If there is either there is no contingent necessary distinction, there is no distinction between what is and what could be. So it's not merely temporality that you're disagreeing with. It's modality.
Yeah, I understand. So you're saying it is conceivably true that it could have been, but it's not physically true that it could have been. So now I'm an idealist.
But you keep moving away from the standard idealist position. So my idealist position is that could have been is located in the idealist perspective. It's located in what would be adequate idealist reasoning. So again, and so one other point from before, we'll get onto this because I think it's really interesting. One other point from before is you said that causation is a convenient fiction. So, I mean, I would say that causation is a process of reasoning, and it has its place, and it's a process of reasoning, a mental process of reasoning that is located in agency, in our considerations to act for certain reasons. Now, but I thought you were saying before that causation was a genuine relation between excitations in mind at large. It's not just a convenient fiction, it's a reality beyond the dashboard.
Insofar as the physical world represents all variables that are significant, I think there is a sense in which we could say causality is legitimate. It's a legitimate fiction.
A legitimate fiction? But we've no evidence of that. We couldn't have any evidence of that, could we?
Well, we are doing philosophy here, and the evidence we have for causality is that it is mighty useful. It works almost every time in practice. We can, put a satellite on an asteroid using Newton's laws. I mean, the effectiveness of causal predictions in science is just astonishing. That's the argument for it.
So you're a pragmatist about truth?
Not in the sense that I don't believe in fundamental truths, but I think the fundamental truths exist outside time, exist in mental space, in that crystal of eternity. And physical truth is a representation of it. That it's convenient but it's a powerful representation because it tends to work very, very, very well. So in that sense, I'm a pragmatist. I think we should use the one thing we have access to, even though I don't think it's fundamentally true that the organizing principles play out or inhere in the physical world. I think they inhere in the crystal of eternity.
Okay, so here's I don't know if you're going to guess what I'm going to say, but if you have the right to say that causation must be real because of how useful it is, you must surely have to say that modality is real because of how useful modality is. Like, we read and reason modally in science, in our laws, in absolutely everything we do. We have to reason modality. Why don't I build the bridge out of blancmange instead of steel and bolt? Because if I build the bridge out of blancmange, then it would collapse. Well, that's modal reasoning. We have to, I mean, in which case, surely there is reality to modality. So I could have done otherwise. I could have built it out of blancmange.
I'll tell you why I resist it. I'm all for pragmatism when it's useful, but I recoil from it when it's dangerous. I will grant you that we can conceive of a different past in which different choices were made. People tried to kill Hitler over 30 times in Germany. If only one had succeeded, maybe 6 million people would have families still around today. So is this conceivable? It is conceivable, yes. But was it possible? I don't think it was possible. Not only physically, but mentally. I don't think it was possible at all, because the crystal of eternity is what it is and not something else. And why in this particular case I resist the pragmatist approach, saying, well, but it's still useful to think of what it could have been. And the reason I resist that is that a lot of people suffer endlessly to the point of suicide, torturing themselves with the could have beens of their lives. If only they have chosen this, that, or the other thing. If only that had happened. And that takes hold of them like a demon, like a dog biting you in the throat and not letting go. And it destroys your life. And the reason that it gets them so strongly and destroys them is that they think that the alternative was actually possible. And that's why I think it's very important to make this distinction between what is conceivable and what is possible. I don't think it is possible for things to have been otherwise. It is not possible. In this universe, it couldn't have been otherwise. And then and there, if you understand this, that demon is out of your life and you can continue to live. But it is entirely reasonable from a philosophical perspective, even useful from a philosophical perspective, to conceive of alternative paths. I grant you that, yeah.
Okay, but we're philosophers, right, at the moment?
Well, we are talking to an audience that contains a lot of normal people. Okay. So that's why I'm careful about these things.
Okay, so fine. But you know what else? Since I put out a video arguing for libertarian free will along these sorts of lines, and I've had people emailing me saying, like, I've saved their life because they thought they'd listened to, the Sam Harrises and the Robert Sapolskys of this world and thought they didn't have any free will and that everything was meaningless. And so I don't think we're going to be able to fit our philosophy to avoid heartache and so on.
In this case, I think we can.
Okay.
I think we can get rid of the demon and still have meaning.
Okay. I am not going to say to you that I think philosophy is all about truth, because I don't. I think it's also involved ethical and aesthetic aspects to it. As I said, I'm not Hegelian. I don't think everything is thought. But yeah, I can't remember what else I was going to say on that. But I think that I think probably where you and I disagree mainly is that you've got a certain realism, which I know you admit to, something that reductive and something realist, which means that you sort of step away from what I would understand as the traditional idealist way of trying to answer certain questions. So to me, causation has to be understood first and foremost from the subjective point of view. How does the concept of causation arise? What does it apply to? Have we any reason to think that it goes beyond experience? And for me, the question is no. So then how do we make sense of causation? Causation is understood as that which we encounter in a concept that arises in childhood when we begin to reason about how to get what it is we want by behaving in certain kinds of ways. We then develop later and we learn things like mathematics and we try to codify relations in non-causal ways, and that's what we do with science. And that, as a pure pursuit, is actually not so useful directly. Like we can have lots of things about the nature of the stars and stuff in quantum physics about what happens when we have these high-speed collisions in CERN, right? That's not useful. It's only useful when we can say, okay, so then if I do this, what will result? And we turn it into technology. And then we are using causal reasoning. We're using causal reasoning based on our mathematics.
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think causation should not be at all a threat to agency, the kind of experience we have of contributing to the way the world is. Then I start to ask about modal reasoning. And for me, modal reasoning plays the same sort of role that causal reasoning does. Modal reasoning is part of thinking, it's possible for me to do this, it's possible for me to do that, and then try to think what would the world be like in counterfactual circumstances, everything from building bridges and so on. So you could say, from a scientific point of view, that what is, and on that I would go with you. As I said, I think we can understand there being mathematical determinism. I think that from the point of view of pure rationality and intellectualism, as far as truth goes, everything is eternal. I think we've had this conversation before. But that, I think, is irrelevant to the question of free will, which is about this is about acting, not about thinking, primarily. And when we are applying thought to acting, the concepts are different. And they're concepts whereby it's perfectly correct to think I could have done otherwise, because that's part of our capacity for deliberating on the options available to us and trying to reason that way. And when we do that, then we have a kind of modal reasoning that keeps salient features fixed. You know, given the laws of physics that I know, given the things I know that's in my cupboard, what do I want to prepare for dinner and so on. Okay. And so it's perfectly correct to say we could have done otherwise. And I don't really know what more you would need or could even possibly have to have libertarian free will.
We can say, I could have done otherwise in the past, insofar as we remove ourselves from the picture and we only look at the surrounding constraints of the world around us. Those external circumstances would have allowed for us to have done differently than we did, or have chosen differently than what we did. I agree with that. But we did what we did because we were who we were, or because we are who we are. The moment you insert yourself back into the system, so now the constraints are not given only by the environment that surrounds you, they are also given by that which you are. And if you do that, then I don't think it was possible for you to have done other than what you did, even though the environment around you would have accommodated for a different course of action. And at the same time, so that eliminates the demon of regret, if you understand things that way. And look, I'm not out to eliminate the demon of regret. I'm out to come up with the best story I can conceive of as true, to get as closer to truth as a monkey can get. That's what I'm trying to do. It so happens that my conclusion eliminates the demon of regret. And once I realize that, then that's what I'm going to emphasize, because I want to have an impact in people's lives. And I think that's a great bonus to have, that you can eliminate the demon of regret. But then what others would argue is, now you created the demon of meaninglessness. Because if you could never have done other than what you did, then you cannot do other than what you will do. And that's true, but there is another way to get to meaning, which is nothing in the universe, not even God itself, can know in advance what you're going to do, because it's a computationally irreducible system. It's chaotic, it's computationally irreducible, and the physical world is not causally closed. So we don't even have access to all the data we would need to make a prediction. Nothing in the universe can know what you will do next. You, God, nobody, nothing. Therefore, your journey into the future is a journey of discovery. It's not a journey of doing the right things, or hopefully we will do the right things. But it's a journey of finding out what it is that you will do. What is this agent that you are? The answer to that question requires observing what that agent does or reacts to different circumstances. So every second into the future is part of this journey of self-discovery, not only your own self, but to a large extent the self of nature, because we are also observing mind at large. We are also observing what nature is doing. And we are the only metacognitive eyes that nature has, as far as we know. There is nothing else out there that observes nature from within with the benefit of metacognition. In other words, that experiences the observation and knows that it is being observed and can ponder it and can pass value judgment. So I think that's where the meaning of life resides. It's this amazing journey of discovery that nature is doing through us. This imbues life, I think, with the strongest meaning possible, because I think this is higher than the more or less flat and silly idea that the meaning of life is to follow the moral rule book and do the right things. Well, that's kind of easy. What is difficult is to get to understand how the system is playing out, is to get to construct an image of the crystal of eternity, even though you're running through it, observing it through a narrow little slit. It's to build that model of what you're looking at. I think that is the great challenge. The great challenge is to pay attention and to discover self and world. And with the bonus that the demon of regret is gone. Not only is gone, it never existed. It was an illusion. So this is what I think is true, not because it's good, but because that's what I think it's true. But once I realize that it has good implications, I emphasize them, of course. I'm interested in reaching the public, not only philosophers like you.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, as may have come out in previous videos, I think the meaning of life is partly what you said, to try to, in some sense, which is what I think you're doing in metaphysics, you're trying to, in some way, comprehend the whole, to get an understanding into what is and being.
Yeah.
And that's the one that philosophers like, right? They often talk about there being nothing greater than philosophy and contemplation and so on. But I certainly wouldn't dismiss the moral side at all. I think there can be a lot of meaning in having children, giving yourself to something else, and act. So less thought, more action, but action towards the good.
I don't dismiss the moral side, Nathan.
No.
It's my fault that I was interpreted that way. Your listeners probably will also misinterpret me that way, and it's my fault. It's my responsibility. I think we are the only eyes in nature that can pass subjective value judgments. In other words, we are the only ones that can build a moral rule book. Nothing else in nature can do that, because everything else unfolds spontaneously. And I think we have the moral responsibility to do that. But I think whether we will do it or not is entirely determined by what and who we are. And there's nothing we can do about it, which doesn't mean that I can shut up, disappear from public life, and not encourage people to be ethical. Because my encouraging people to do that is part of the inputs of the deterministic systems that they are. Maybe they will do the right thing because they heard me or you or somebody else say the right thing. Now, we couldn't have done other than to say the right thing. but they need to hear that said in order to do the right thing. It's like a computer. A computer has many integrated circuits. It's a purely deterministic system. We know how to predict exactly everything that's going to happen. And what we can't predict doesn't have any effect. We call it signal to noise ratio. But if you remove a chip from that deterministic system, it will not work. Because a chip receives inputs, computes them, produces some outputs that are needed by the next chip, and which will produce outputs that are inputs for yet the next chip, and so on and so forth. So to say that everything is deterministic doesn't mean that there is nothing for us to do. We still have to play our role. We still have to be a chip in the system. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
And part of playing my role as one tiny chip in the system is to say we are the sole agents that are imbued with moral responsibility. The buck stops with us. We have to pass appropriate value judgment. Now, I can't help but say what I'm saying, and you can't help but hear what I'm saying. But because I said what I said, it would do something that maybe otherwise you wouldn't have done. Now I'm getting into model thinking anymore. So to say that everything is deterministic and that life is a journey of discovery doesn't mean that there is nothing to do. We still have to play our roles. Otherwise, conceivably, the system wouldn't reach that point into the future, that future state that it will reach.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you noted, I mean, you said otherwise this and otherwise that,
Yeah,
and we still have to. It's all part of that, and I think that's unavoidable when talking about action and deliberation. So it seems to me that we have. But the way I look at it is, if I'm directing my thought to action and morality, I have to deploy the conceptual apparatus of causation, the conceptual apparatus of could have done otherwise, conceptual apparatus of what could otherwise have been. And so I have to take those seriously when I'm considering action. And so from that point of view, I'm going to affirm libertarian free will, right? When I am acting, I am in libertarian free will reasoning mode. When I'm sitting as an absolute idealist, or I'm doing logic, or I'm doing mathematics, or I'm not that I do this, but if I was going to be a theoretical physicist, I'm not aware of my subjectivity. I'm not presenting myself as an agent. I'm presenting myself as a detached intellect. I'm not usually, well, when I'm doing logic and epistemology, I might be concerned about how I know these things. But if I'm just sort of thinking about truth in its purest, then I'm going to come to these sorts of conclusions that you're mentioning about the crystalline structure and so on. Now, what it seems to me you do is then say, oh, and the crystalline structure is actually what reality is. And all this stuff, when I'm an agent, is somehow derivative or not as real. And so I can, as a philosopher, affirm that the truth and how it really is as I understand as in the mathematics and so on. And so don't worry yourself on the other side. And that's the move that I just don't want to do. I want to say that there's nothing more legitimate or less legitimate about seeing things atemporally, eternally in this perfect, pure, sort of platonic realm than there is in the down and dirty matters of cleaning your teeth, buying toothpaste, and deciding whether or not to have a child. So I think these two things are on a par, and so I think that meaning is found in both these realms. There's meaning in the. So I don't necessarily think we disagree, but meaning is in the attempt to understand the universe, and it's also in the taking of responsibility and in feeling I actually think there is something to be felt in the responsibility and the importance of the decisions that we make, because if we do things otherwise, bad things would happen, right? If I belt my kids rather than rein in my anger at the next thing they're doing, that matters. That matters. And also believing that, and this maybe is a step you wouldn't take, but believing that genuinely the results are something I have contributed to, and I'm not merely being played like a fiddle by mind at large. That there is meaning there as well. And then I also think the other side is to do with creativity and art and beauty and everything like that. But we haven't really talked about that. It's not so related.
I don't think we are played like a fiddle by mind at large. I think we are as much universal mind as mind at large is. We are playing ourselves in a sense. But look, I agree with you more than maybe obvious, because the universe and even we ourselves are computationally irreducible. It is impossible to create a model of a human being from physical first principles and run it for a meaningful amount of time, like 100 microseconds in real life. It would take you an unimaginable number of the ages of the universe for us to be able to do that from first principles. So this is not only, it's a practical limitation, but it's an extraordinarily strong practical limitation, because the problem of simulating things from first principles entails a geometric explosion of parameters. It's an explosion of complexity. So although it's a practical problem, there is no end in sight for that problem. It's almost a fundamental problem. So even a human being is computationally irreducible. We cannot know, nothing in nature can know what we will do next. So everything happens as if libertarian free will were true. And we can live accordingly, provided that we don't mistake this approximation we are making, everything happens as though we had libertarian free will, and then conclude that regret is validated, that you really could have done differently than that horrible decision you've taken. So that demon I want to keep out, because nothing in my views of what's happening justifies that demon. So once you have jailed that demon or eliminate, vanquished it, now you can give yourself permission to live life as though you had libertarian free will, because in practice, it makes no difference. Nothing in the universe can know what you will do next until you actually choose to do it. Not even God itself can know. So for all practical purposes, looking to the future, everybody has libertarian free will. But don't apply that retroactively to the past, because I think that is unjustified. That's my position.
And by unjustified, you mean unhelpful?
Well, it's not unjustified. I don't think it's true that you could have done differently than you did. But it is in practice okay to think that you can do in the future whatever it is that you will do. Why in practice it's the same? Because nothing can know what you will do. Not you, not God, nobody, nothing. So you might as well think that you have libertarian free will, as long as you don't open the door to the demon of regret.
Yeah. Well, I think so. In terms of usefulness, I don't think regret is always a demon. I think regret can be something quite useful in many ways, as long as it doesn't debilitate you. I mean, there are certain things that I did at the time, I didn't think much of it, and then in hindsight, I was confronted with the awfulness of what I'd done, and I'm glad I felt regret. I wouldn't not want to feel regret. It was an important part of learning a lesson and resolving, getting myself right with the people I need to get myself right with, and so on. So I think the experience of being an agent in the world, not merely an object in the world, but an agent in the world that is contributing to our lives and our decisions, has to come with both the sense of accomplishment and achievement and involvement in the good, and a sense of culpability and guilt and regret too. It just depends how you react to it. I mean, you can react to that in ways to learn lessons and resolve to be different, or to make peace with those you need to make peace with, or you can use it to sit at home and not want to step outside, or not want to get involved in the world in case you hurt somebody, and then that's debilitating. So, but I wouldn't have seen that the place to solve that is with a metaphysics.
Well, we all do metaphysics, whether we know it or
True.
not, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Look, I agree that we have to derive lessons from the past. Those are the segments of the crystal of eternity that we already traversed with our slit. It's input data, it's information. We should use the information we have to learn, to improve ourselves in the future. I think what is killing is the metaphysical notion that it truly was possible for you to have done differently. I don't think that is required to derive lessons from the past. You can objectively look at the past and see what happened, and you think, okay, this is a lesson I learned. It will be different in the future. But when you are attached to the past because you metaphysically and physically believe that you could have done otherwise, I think that is useless. That is a stone that shackles you in the ankle and doesn't allow you to move forward. And I don't think there is anything to justify that. Regarding moral responsibility, I don't think anything I said removes moral responsibility from past acts. What it removes is the impetus to revenge. For instance, if you look at the criminal system in the US, it's based on revenge taking. During sentencing hearings, the victims or the family members of the victims, they tell the judge what the crime did for them, how it ruined their lives and all that. So this is all part of that revenge. I mean, jury by trial of your peers instead of judges that are trained to pass judgment. It's a rather scary system in the US, but it's driven by peer revenge. If you look at the Netherlands, and I'm not, well, I'm going to put the Netherlands above the US now. Not because I want to do it systematically, but because in this case, I think it's appropriate. The entire justice system is not based on revenge. It's based on reducing the risk of future crimes. And so for that, you do not need to believe that the criminal actually could have done other than the criminal did. In the US, you need that. If you're talking about revenge, you have to believe that the criminal had a true choice and things could have been differently. If that's not metaphysically possible, then you get a system like in the Netherlands, which is sentencing is used for two reasons, and they split these two reasons in the sentencing. The first part is deterrence. Even if the criminal couldn't have done differently, if the criminal goes to jail for 10 years and all other potential criminals watch that happen, that becomes input data into their integrated circuit that will lead to different outputs because they don't want to be jailed for 10 years. You see, so that's deterrence. That's the first part of the sentence. The second part of the sentence is what we call TBS, which is after you've completed the deterrence part of your sentence, you will be locked up in a psychiatric institution, which is effectively a prison, but with psychiatrists and all that. And you will only be allowed out when the psychiatrists judge that you are no longer a severe enough risk for society. In other words, the whole thing is geared towards reducing the risk of crime, not towards attributing personal responsibility under the notion that the criminal could have done differently. You don't need any of that to still apply the law this way. You do not need to believe that people could have done differently than what they did. Of course they could, and they are who they are, and they aren't another person. But you apply deterrence, and you apply this provision that you don't let people out until psychiatrists who are specialized in this judge that the risk is now reduced enough that you can be allowed carefully back into society. I think that's the mature way to go about things. You still carry moral responsibility because you will be the one subject to jail to deter others. And you still be the one who is not allowed out if they think that your deterministic system, despite all the new inputs, will still produce a criminal output. You still have the notion of responsibility without the notion of it could have been differently. And then revenge is out of the picture. No, you're tried by 3 judges, not by 12 of your peers, people picked off the streets who have no education, no training. Good, my God, if I were tried in the US, I would shit my pants, because most people out there are just silly. You're tried by 3 judges, 3 because to avoid a deadlock, who are trained to consider evidence objectively and properly, who are trained in the law. And the sentencing is also given by those 3 judges based on the risk you represent for society, not the amount of suffering you caused for other people that want to take revenge on you. At the end of the day, they end up taking revenge anyway, but it's not how the system is run.
Yeah. Okay. So, the moral responsibility then, though, doesn't, it seems to be more just under that system. It's about purely about prevention, right?
As far as the criminal justice system is concerned, yeah, I think outside the criminal system, I think moral responsibility is still critical. What's happening now in the discussions around Ukraine, I think, is morally catastrophic. To reward an invader, to reward heinous crimes committed against civilian populations, to reward that, I think it's barbaric. It's beyond fascist. It's inhuman. And I think we are the ones that can pass that judgment, and we should pass that judgment. Now, we could not pass that judgment if we actually pass it. But it's important that we play our roles in this deterministic system that nobody knows the future of. We are each a little IC in the computer, and we have to take our inputs and produce our outputs for the benefit of the other ICs. And none of us, not even the builder, knows where that system is going. And therefore, you might as well live as if you had libertarian free will, because in practice, it's the same.
Yeah, okay. So I don't really want to jump into the politics of things, but keeping on the philosophical side of what you said, it seems as though the Dutch system wouldn't even require moral responsibility. I mean, for example, in the UK, there was a law passed about banning American bully dogs because there were lots of attacks when they came over. They're very violent dogs and they injured a lot of children and things like that. And so then they were put down. Now, there's no thinking there about them being morally responsible. The entire thing was purely on this prevention side of things. So it seems to me you can have the Dutch system that you've talked about. You don't need could have done otherwise. You also don't need moral responsibility. You just need a pragmatic approach. So that's one thing. But then also, it seems to me that the kind of motivation to appease Putin, as say Trump might be attempting right now, and you're talking about as rewarding it, well, that is also done on pragmatic grounds of, well, we just need to get this all to end to stop people from dying. This isn't really about moral responsibility of Putin. This is about just trying to... And so on that side, you seem to be thinking, no, there needs to be some kind of punishment going on here for what they've done.
No, it's too pragmatic. It's too pragmatic. Look, the people who suffered and died, we can't bring them back. It's about reducing suffering and dying in the future. But I think this is a case where moral thinking is pragmatically important, because if you, continuing that example, if you create an artificial peace that's totally unsustainable, and people will stop dying and suffering for 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but you do that in a way that you guarantee things will explode later again and be much worse, then maybe it's better to let it actually fizzle out now, to not put a artificial barrier into the dynamic of the system that would just allow both sides to rearm and get stronger and do much more heinous stuff, particularly the invader side. So from a pragmatic reasoning, I think moral thinking here applies too. I don't think moral thinking should be eliminated. On the contrary, I think it should be an integral part of our lives. I'm just saying that in the justice system, when you allow the justice system to be driven by revenge, I think you end up in a very strange, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, of course. I don't think revenge is at all productive or helpful, but I think that that's because it's immoral, not just because it's unhelpful. And so I think I probably have a more robust sense of morality that's not. I'm not a utilitarian for sure. So that, but okay, let's not. So we've talked now, I think, a lot about. Well, maybe just before we go on to mind at large and how we understand free will from the point of view of the universe, because that's definitely where I want to go. It seems that despite some of the discussions we've had about you happy to say there is libertarian free will in a sense, but not ultimately, right? That seems to be
things play out into the future as though there were libertarian free will.
So yeah, but when I've heard you describe yourself, you described your view mainly as a compatibilist view, and you'd said earlier on tonight that it depends what we identify with. We don't identify with our brains, but that's fine because it's not our brains that causes us to behave this way. We identify with our desires and so on.
Yeah.
So for me, a lot of the moral question arises when we recognize our own wants and we recognize the wants of others. And usually those others can be individuals as well, but they could also be collectives at a certain level. It could be your country or your family or your city or whatever. And morality is often understood as where those two things rub up against each other and we're faced with the choice of doing what we want or what we should do or ought to do or our duties or what other people want us to do. So are you saying that it depends on which of the two we identify with most as to what we will do that determines what we do?
No, it's about that alternative definition of free will as something totally independent of determinism or randomness. You just say a decision is freely taken if it is taken by that which I identify with. So even though it's determined by that which I identify with. So that's a compatibilist view because everything can be fully determined, even physically fully determined. I don't believe that the physical world is causally closed, but even if it were, it would still be compatible with that. And the question then boils down to what is it that you do identify with? If you identify with the ego, which is a particular psychic process with maximum information integration, if that's what you identify with, then a lot of what you do is not determined by your ego. A lot of your choices are not determined by your ego. Your ego will determine what is the best way to work after you hear the traffic announcement in the radio. Your ego will determine what is the best mortgage package to get your next house, to buy your next house. But the ego will not determine who you fall in love with. Most often, it will not determine who you vote for. It will not determine your likes and dislikes. It will not determine what you do for a hobby. Mostly not. It will not determine how you feel about things, about other people, about the world. A lot of our choices are made by what Jungian psychologists call the unconscious. It's not unconscious, it's not metacognitive, and it's dissociated, so cannot be accessed from the ego, but it impinges on the ego from below. And we call it reflex decision or a passionate decision, choices made by intuitions and feelings as opposed to the machinations and reasoning of the ego. Sometimes the unconscious will even co-opt the ego, hijack the ego, and make the ego think that the ego made the decision. No, it didn't. It just found a nice narrative to justify the decision to itself. Studies show that this is how we decide most of the times. We make the decision first, and then we rationalize it. So the ego sort of tries to find a way to tell itself that, oh, I made the decision. No, you haven't. Studies show that. But if we were to identify emotionally, if we truly felt that we are the totality of being, so not only the ego, but the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, the whole of the universal mind, which is what we are. Our subjectivity is that subjectivity. It comes from nowhere else. If you, in the course of your maturing through life, through all the suffering we all go through, you get to a point where that's what you actually identify with. Then you will feel like you have absolute free will under this definition. You will feel that all of your choices were made by that which you do identify with. It's difficult to get to that point. I'm not there, but I have entered that space a couple of times. It's not abiding, but I have had that experience. Once I made a few years ago, 6 years ago, I made a horrible decision that led to an accident that gave me much more severe tinnitus than I had. This ghost, extremely annoying sound in the ears. I almost killed myself twice because of that, and it was a decision I took. I removed the siren, an alarm siren, from my wall myself, knowing full well that unless I would put it in maintenance mode, which I didn't know how to do, it would go off in my hands, and I still did it, and it destroyed my inner ears. And I felt that that decision was not taken by me. It was a completely rational decision. Who the hell made that decision? But recently, several times recently, I sort of entered a space where, oh no, I chose to screw my ears. I chose to suffer like a dog, year in, year out. I owned that decision, and then I slipped out of it, of that space. And I'm back to, how the hell, who did that? I want to kill the guy who took that decision. I'm back to that. But every now and then I can slip back into that space and own it. And so there is a way to truly have free will under this definition, which is compatible with determinism, which is, it is the core subjectivity in you that is you, or what Jung would call the self with capital S. It is that is the agent behind every single choice. And it is you. It is truly you. And if every choice is made by that and you identify with that, then there are no external constraints. There's nothing forcing a choice on you that you don't want to make, because you're the whole system. You're the whole shebang. And there is a place in the mind that you can enter where there is a feeling of absolute free will. In that definition, it's still determined. Everything is still determined by what you are. And you are what you are, and you can't be other than what you are. We are back to Schopenhauer. We can choose according to our will, but not will our will. So that you will never escape. But there are no external constraints of any bearing on the decision, because you identify with the entire system. It is possible to enter that space. I've entered it a couple of times, very briefly, and then I fall back to hell. But it's a very nice space.
Yeah, so I think I think I know what you're talking about, and there certainly are those moments where your individuality is lost or is lessened. And actually, I think that is part of what makes morality, which is what I was getting at before, is you can recognize a conflict or a tension between your personal wants, which are more directly associated with you, and wants at a distance, whether that's the wants of a loved one or a child or a family. And then there are these sorts of concentric circles around which that might be. It could be, your community, your nation, but it could then extend to a stranger. And that you can therefore make decisions. In some ways, I think where people go wrong, and I think probably Schopenhauer would put it in these terms as well, is that, well, if I did something for the sake of another, it must be because I wanted to do it for the sake of another.
Course.
So I ultimately did what I want. I don't think that's a helpful way to look at it, because it seems to me that it's perfectly correct for me to say that, no, I didn't want to do that. I did it because it's the right thing to do. I didn't want to do it, but I did it anyway. The only reason you'd say no, you wanted to, is if you have this very broad, almost stripped of any kind of meaning notion of a want, which means it's just a catch-all phrase for whatever was your motivation. Or it just means I decided to, I wanted to, I decided to, or I chose to. If I'm understanding a want as something that is not me, or I just don't feel the force of that argument at all, because for me, so much of the deliberation that really matters, that really counts, is when you have to recognize that. So you can say something on that if you want, but then I've got this other thing I wanted to ask you as well before. I'll let you say
I want to comment on this very, very, very briefly. So you didn't want to do A, but you did A for the sake of other people. What you would want to do for yourself was B, but you did A, not for yourself, but for other people. Now, that agent that made that choice, and then you said, well, I did it because it was the right thing to do it for other people and not for me. That's why I chose A and not B. For myself, I wanted B, but I did A because it's the right thing to do. The agent at that moment of the choice, did that agent want to do the right thing?
Well, I mean, again, it's that I don't think they did want to, but they chose to. And so much of it's going to depend on what language you use at this point. So the feeling of being out of control is that you can't control your wants, right? So if you have this idea of a want is something that I can't control, it just is, then as soon as you say anything you do has to be because you wanted to, then it's trivially true then that you can't have chosen anything and you're just dancing to your own tune.
Yes.
But that's not an argument. That to me is just a way of, by effectively defining it into being. Whereas I think the pushback is that there's no argument against free will there. What seems to be going on is that there are things that I would recognize as being the sorts of things you mentioned, maybe who you fall in love with. And you know what? More often than not, it's not necessarily in such pure terms. You know, I'm married and you can't always control who you might be attracted to. And then you could recognize that I want to do this, but it's the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is to move away or something, right? So I think the reality of our lived, if I'm trying to explain the phenomenology of free will, if I'm trying to provide a philosophical account of being an agent in the world, this is where freedom and meaning really rubs up against it, is where I can be confronted with a circumstance where I can see on the one hand, I want to do A, and I think it's perfectly correct and true to say, I want to do A, yet I did B for other reasons. And those reasons were not wants, they were something else. And I chose to nevertheless do B despite my wants.
There has to be a meta want that wanted something for the other reasons.
Why?
Otherwise, there would be no impetus to action.
So but then this is where the Frankfurt model goes. Do you know that one?
The Frankfurt?
Yeah, Frankfurt's model, his compatibilist model.
Know.
So and this is where my second question was. So it's a good scenario to discuss it in. So he considers like an addict. Okay, so an addict can want, let's say it's, I don't know, heroin, right? They want heroin, but they don't want to want heroin. They want to be free of their want for heroin. Now, he says that if they take heroin, even though they did what they want, they didn't do what they wanted to want. So they're out of alignment. They have a first order desire that was enacted, but they had an overriding second order desire that was frustrated because they're out of sync. So he thinks that's not a free act. They didn't have the free will. They are a wanton, he calls them. They are driven by their own desires. And it's when that happens that we think of ourselves as not being free. We are now being controlled by our base instincts or these sorts of things. However, if we might want something else, we might want not to want that, but want to be able to say no to the drugs being offered. If we do that, if our acted, because he thinks that there's multiple first level wants. They both want to take the heroin and they also want to not have to spend their money. And so there's all this selection, one of which will become active, and that's not necessarily the one that they wanted to want. It could win out just because it was overwhelming or strong or irresistible or something of that sort. So he has the model that seems to me you're suggesting, where we have these higher order wants. So every time to explain what happened, you could sometimes you'd be appealing to just the first order want that was the strongest one out, but it wasn't free because it wasn't wanted. It wasn't. And so you have he calls some things volitions and some things willing. So he has these slightly two different terms, but effectively you can see how the model works. Now, what happens with his one is that every time you want to say, but if you did that, you must have this higher order want in order to do that. Like I've given the example, I recognize before me, I have the want to do this thing over here that I think of as me, but then I have the right thing, and I want to want the right thing. I want doing the right thing to win out. Now, if I succeed in doing that, then I've been free. If not, I think I'm sort of being pulled by temptation, or, this is the old religious language way of explaining it. Now, in that case, then you can do the Schopenhauer move and say, but every time you think like you've made a choice, it's really just there's a higher level want dictating things. But then you can equally say, and what made it that want out of the other kinds of wants to wants we could have? So you end up with this sort of regress of wants to choices. And then I don't see any reason why you'd say that ultimately it bottoms out in a want, which is nothing to do with you, or ultimately it bottoms out in a choice, in which case you control. For me, they're just two aspects of the same thing. There's a decision made. It has some reasons for it, desires or whatever. But then there's an irrational, non-rational aspect that is genuinely free, which is the choice. And so a decision has a choice aspect and a reasons aspect. And those reasons could be wants, or they could be duties, moral decisions. They could be anything.
But you still need to want to do your duty. You still need to want to be morally righteous and correct. You still need to want to do the right thing, because if you don't want to do the right thing, you don't do the right thing.
Well, but I don't see that. I mean, so are you using want in any term other than just that which motivated you?
I don't think it's even harmful to acknowledge that to be morally adequate, we need to want to be morally adequate. Look, the reality of the human mind is that we have myriad wants that are inconsistent, conflicting, distributed over multiple levels, starting at the physiological level. You need to go to the toilet, you want to eat, you want to drink, you want to have sex, all the way to very high abstract levels, like I want to understand the universe, or I want to be true to God, and everything in between. And all these wants, they are in competition. It's not like there is only one want in the human mind. There are models in psychology that metaphorically think of one human mind as a bus with many people, and each of those people represents a certain want. And then they are in competition to drive the choices that are ultimately made. That's how I see things. There are these various wants at multiple levels, from the physiological to the spiritual and everything in between. And then they are tugging and pulling on the same ropes to see who wins out at the end. But I think whoever wins is a want too. It's not pure abstraction. Even if the want that wins, it's a moral, spiritual, fairly abstract want, you still want to do that. You still want to do the right thing. You still want to do the righteous thing at the spiritual level, for instance. There has to be, because the will, it is the impetus for mental action. It's the fuel of the unfolding of mental processes, right? That's why Schopenhauer said that at the end of the chain of reduction, there is only the will. Because it's the fuel for everything else. You can look upon everything else as a kind of unfolding of the will. The will is the impetus. There is no action without impetus, just like the car doesn't move without fuel. So whoever wins, I think, I am with Schopenhauer here. At the end of the day, it is a want of some form or another. But yes, sometimes it's the physiological want that wins. Sometimes it's the philosophical want. Sometimes it's the spiritual want. Sometimes it's the moral want that wins. but it has to be an impetus of some form that leads to an action, to a decision.
Yeah, so I think I'd agree. Certainly, I think volition is, or will, is that kind of raw impetus, as you're saying. And if all want means is a possible course of action, I mean, so there are certain things that you would just have. I would say not that I just have no want to do it, but I'd have no reason to do it. I mean, that maybe it's because I'm thinking in a deliberative circumstance. So, am I free to, I don't know, stab myself horribly with that pen? No, because I'd have no reason to do that. So there is a certain
you have no want to do that.
Right, reason or want. Right, okay. But then I think you're confronted with the possibility that given that there are a range of wants/reasons for action, you could say that the action that is taken is just a matter of which is the strongest.
Yep.
Or you might think that it's not like Newtonian forces that all kind of act on my mind and whichever, and I passively observe and just sort of see the tug of war and see which one wins. You could also have the idea that there is no predetermined winner, and that they're all sort of like you're holding counsel and they're making their case and you're deliberating and you're thinking of all of the reasons to go with one or the other, and then you choose.
You are a philosopher, and because you are who you are, and in your case, this deliberation is the highest want, is the strongest want. That's how you're put together. You can't escape who you are. And you validate that to yourself, saying this is the highest possible want that I can have. It's the correct and true want, the most balanced, the one that takes into account most variables, the most correct. Other people are put together differently. Other people think that to be at this, to operate at this abstract level is a kind of a waste of life, because it doesn't mobilize the energies that feed them, because they are different people. So in their case, in the 19th century, we would have called them the aesthetes. These are sensory-oriented people, and their wants are driven by sensation, and driven by a certain feeling about the fullness of life, which they experience differently than you and I. It's a different kind of want, because they are different types of people, and which want wins is given by what you are, what I am, what they are. We can't escape what we are. That's how I see things. I sense that you are trying to create out of wants, the multitude and variety of wants, you're trying to create a new category that is not a want. It's a higher level thing that we don't call a want, and therefore it's free from want. But I think that ultimately it is a want. It's a different type of want than the aesthetes wants. It's the want you and I have, but it's a want. Okay. I think.
So I think if you could call any impulse to act a want, but then I think that it's less obvious that we have no control of our wants. We have no input into our wants. It's certainly less obvious. And so, I mean, if you wanted to look, David Davidson has a paper along this route when he's actually trying to make sense of what's called weakness of will, which is times when we can judge what the best course of action is and yet do something else. And how we think all things can. So there is a technical way of cashing it out, and Robert Kane, who's a libertarian, has another way of doing it. For me, I just think that the Schopenhauerian argument of everything you do is a want and you can't control your wants is dogmatic. I don't see it as being a knockdown argument against the possibility of, we're going back to could have done otherwise and so on. But if I'm reflecting and I'm trying to explain the phenomenology of agency, it doesn't seem to me as though I'm effectively a passive observer of these wants in a tug of war and then watching what unfolds. It feels as though I'm in the mix and I'm involved in the process, and I am being pulled in different directions, but I can push
by
back,
yourself, of course. Yeah.
Push back, and So okay, I mean, I think you can understand things either way with that. Because we always end up talking for so long. It's always very interesting.
Look, it could come down to a linguistic definition of the word want. We can define it in a way that I would agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. And I think so much of it is semantics on that. That it's, I mean, you're not deploying it as an argument against free will, but it often is used as an argument against free will. That, well, you can't control your wants, obviously, and everything you do must be because you wanted to do it, obviously. So you have no control of what you do, obviously.
So you can define a want, restrict it to a lower level, closer to the physiology side, and say that everything that involves pondering and deliberation, you say from that level on, I don't call it a want. I will call it pondering and deliberation. I would argue that it's still a want. It's something in you that still drives you to choose in that way, to want to choose in that manner. But we can define the word in a way that I would then agree with you and say, okay, under that definition, that's not a want. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Should we talk about mind at large then? Because you have a different view about free will when we start to get to the level of the cosmos.
Yeah. So look, normally I call mind at large everything that is left off of universal consciousness after we accounted for dissociated alters or living organisms. I think mind at large is also driven by a form of endogenous impetus, which Schopenhauer called the will. I'm comfortable giving it that name. But at the level of universal consciousness, you get mind at large plus all the alters, all the living organisms, the sum total of existence. That's universal consciousness. At that level, there are no external forces impinging on your choices because you are the sum total of everything that's going on. And then by definition, whatever is done is decided by what you are, because you are the only thing that is. And then you could speak of complete free will at that level. It's not free will in a libertarian sense, because universal consciousness is what it is and not something else it could have conceivably been. And therefore, it would do as it will do, not in a different way, as it would have done if it were differently. So you're still stuck to what you are and choosing according to what you are, but not according to anything beyond what you are. And that, under a certain definition, is absolute free will. Yeah.
Yeah, so I don't think I really differ with you on this one. I think that will, I'm going to use the word absolute, that the absolute's will, it does have will. And in a sense, it's not free. But I think that's because could have done otherwise is something that operates at the level of pure agency, as I've talked about, that the concepts of could have done otherwise and causation are intimately tied with our agency as agents in the world. And there is the distinction between how I act and how that brings about things that are outside of me in the world. So the level of the absolute as well, you have complete unity. I mean, I'm a monist, but that's a conceptual monism as well. So it's not just the sum total of everything concrete or the sum total of everything mental. It's the sum total of where there's the harmonization of all concepts and difference itself. So therefore, truth and beauty and goodness at the level of the absolute are all one. And so it couldn't have been otherwise, because at that level, the truth is the truth as well. And that then does rule out. Could have been otherwise. The same reason I say that when I'm doing my crystalline mathematics, there are no other possibilities. But I mean, maybe though you could think that because goodness is linked with it, then. So I guess I would say that I think the absolute is necessary, but it's necessary because even though there are multiple possibilities from the point of having a coherent set of propositions or conception of the world intellectually, as Leibniz might say, this is the best one. It's a rough, not very good way of saying it, but since truth has to, at the level of the absolute, be harmonized with ultimate goodness and ultimate beauty,
then it's per force the best of all possible universes.
Per force the best, most beautiful, most glorious, and world, and so that's what sets the truth, the actuality. That's where the actualization occurs. So yeah, but I think then where I don't think in the absolute there is this ultimate, because the absolute's main is both a unity and a diversity. It's not a unity that dissolves all difference. Like we can't imagine it. We get pretty apophatic at that point. There's only very few things that we can say. Then the free will is something that we experience in as much as we are not the absolute, which might be basically what you're saying. In as much as there is an outside,
We experience free will insofar as we are or are not the absolute. What did you mean?
Insofar as we are not the absolute. Because
then we do have free will.
Yeah, so you're kind of saying the reverse in some ways, but I'm wondering if they're pretty similar. So your view is that because I think our differences are becoming clear here, and I don't know if they're just terminological or not, but let me think this through. So your view is that you are acting freely when the source of your actions is something that you can call you.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we recognize that we are universal consciousness, we are a doing of universal consciousness, we recognize that the tree blowing in the wind outside our window, the sun rising in the morning, is a doing of us. So we are so free because we have effective omnipotence that everything happens according to our will. Because
and it couldn't have been otherwise. Yeah.
It couldn't have been otherwise. So we don't have libertarian free will, but we have this compatibilist free will ultimately, because ultimately we are, in some sense, doing the universe.
Yeah, because what limits free will are external constraints. But if they too are you, then there's nothing limiting it, and therefore you're free.
Yeah. So whereas I am thinking that ultimate freedom is demonstrated in being able to act. So a certain moral freedom, we're taking it from morally, is in the capacity to have the power to act for the sake of the not us.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah.
So there needs to be the other, right? The other will, whether that's the wants or desires or wills of my family, my children, and so on. And I am free to the degree to which I am able to act for the sake of others. Like I can totally act for my own sake, and I can choose, what chocolate bar to buy at the store or something, and I could have done otherwise. But that's not true freedom, because I'm effectively then a slave to my desires or a slave to my impulses, which might be the kind of thing you're talking about with our unconscious. And so maybe in that case, I might be tugged along. But genuine freedom is the capacity to recognize an otherness, to will or desire, and to behave for the sake of that. So in some sense, to step outside of yourself. So if there were no outside of yourself, then that kind of freedom no longer exists. Yeah.
You see free will as a form of liberation from egocentrism, and that requires a context into which you're liberated.
Well put.
Why do you hesitate in calling that impulse towards the liberation a form of will?
Am I not calling it a form of will?
Well, you're saying, a
want.
A want, yeah.
Well, because I think that it's a miscategorization, but that's because because I'm isolating wants as being what I would consider to be internal impulses, rather than a recognition of another impulse. So, I mean, at this point, even if you're trying to be as philosophical and metaphysical as you can, it is much harder to use philosophical language purely when talking about the moral sphere. The religious language is often better suited for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so I think in that case, you can recognize what we might call higher or lower aspects of your nature. And if you want to call them your nature, you can. But there's a way in which you can see certain impulses that you can recognize as issuing from you being in conflict with other kinds of impulses that seem to be calling you beyond yourself or calling you to act for something higher. And that something higher can be in the interests of your fellow man, your neighbors, and so on, as I've talked about, or they can be directed to something higher, which religiously we'd say call God, and I would call God, maybe call it universal consciousness. But I think in those moments, rather than have the experience that it seems as though you're gesturing towards, which is a kind of loss of self or a stretching of one's identity to remove the distinction between the other and the self, and so see that actually I am doing everything. I think that free will occurs where we both recognize that, no, I am not that, and yet I so behave.
But past the linguistic contradictions, it's the same thing we're saying. Yes, I understand you. Yeah.
You think it's the same thing?
Yeah, because you're defining the word will and want in a way that requires this external context, and that comes together with, okay, I am not that, but I will towards that. And what I'm saying is that I am that. Therefore, in willing for myself, I'm willing beyond myself, because I now recognize that I am the whole thing. So in both cases, there is a movement from the purely individual to the broad and general. There's a movement towards the other in both cases. In my case, I do that through an identification with the other. In your case, you do that by staying identified with the self, but then transcending the will. So there is the same movement towards the other, but the language is different and apparently contradictory because of that. I think what's happening is that what I see as a refinement of the will from the purely individual to the collective, you create a separate category for. You say the will applies within the individual boundaries. Once I cross that threshold, I will not call it a want anymore. I will call it a form of, there is a wonderful English word for that. Not philanthropy, but selfless action.
Altruism.
Altruism. Yeah. So I regard altruism as a range within a continuous of wanting. And you regard it as a separate category. And then there is a good basis for conceptually defining that category in a clean way, which is to say, once you cross the boundary of the self, now I will call it altruism. It's perfectly valid to do that. I don't do it because I like to keep on highlighting the impetus, the mental energy aspect that leads to action and choice. And then I call that the will or the want. So I keep on trying to highlight that, and therefore I use the spectrum as opposed to different categories.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so and it's probably because it's probably because your background is scientific and mine is religious, and so there's you're kind of starting from a different conception, and so the language use is different. But yeah, I think that we encounter then that moral duty call draw in that conflict, in deliberation for action. And for me, the freedom comes in recognizing the way in which we contribute to the choices we make, the ones that are important, where what we might call, maybe it's egocentric want compared to something more altruistic or beyond. That's where we experience the moral dilemma and the draw. And I think my libertarian free will comes in there, where I think that's a genuine choice. It's experienced as a genuine choice, and I think there's no reason to then say it isn't. Then where you get choices further down the road where we act without that deliberation, you might say, oh, so we weren't free then. But in some ways, what that is that's just an echo of the past decisions we have made where there was a deliberation. So, I mean, for example, if I was working in retail and someone gave me cash, the first time I get that money in my hands, I think I could put it through the till and ring it up, but they haven't asked for a receipt, or do I stick it in my pocket, right? First time, that might be something I'm really pulled in both ways and deliberating. I know what I should do, but I know what I want to do. I'm going to use that language. I want to stick it in my pocket, but I know I shouldn't. And let's say I put it in the till, right? Next time that happens, maybe again I think, oh, this has happened again. But oh well, it's easier then to put it in the till. The 10th time, I don't even think about it anymore. I just put it in the till.
Yeah.
Or first time I put it in my pocket, next time, much easier for it to go in my pocket. And then the 12th time, I don't even think about it. I just go, sweet, put it in my pocket. It's almost instinctual. So that's my Aristotelianism possibly coming through, in that the way we behave instinctively today is not unchosen. It's just been pre-chosen through those times in the past where we have habitually caused us to be who we are right now. So yes, it flows out of who we are, flows out of our desires, but who we are has partly been shaped not purely by our decisions in the past. It's also partly shaped, of course, by our biology, by our family, by our culture. I don't think we are individuals. We're clearly not individuals. We are entwined within a whole series of sort of circles of identity that all go to make up ourselves. But there is still a level at the level of the individual where there is some wiggle room, I think, and that can change who we become and change how we behave. And we should think of ourselves as involved in that process. And that's the experience of agency. And it's at that point where we kind of come face to face with the absolute as not our will, as some kind of ideal will that we might call the good. And we can either align ourselves with that, which would be a certain kind of freedom, or retreat from it. Now, it seems to me on your model, though, there's no, ultimately, the internal is also universal consciousness. Maybe I'm talking more about the difference between what you're calling mind at large and its dissociated alters. I don't know.
Well, if I were to speak religious language, because we agree that it's the most appropriate language in this case, you could say that once you cross the threshold of what is beneficial to you as an individual and you start making altruistic choices, the choice you're making is to let the will of God express itself through you. In other words, the choice you make is to open a gate, to allow God to flow through you and make divine choices through you, which are by definition not those that favor the individual. In my own inner dialogue, I use the old philosophical idea of the daimon, which is not a demon. It's the daimon, which is a word that philosophers have used for thousands of years, literally, to talk about the ebb and flow of the impersonal within us. That which wants to express itself through us, but doesn't give a damn about us. It doesn't worry whether you're going to have food on your table tomorrow or a roof over your head. It wants to express something in the world through you, or to learn, so get something from the world through you in a way that has no correlation, a very little correlation with individuality. And so I use in my own inner dialogue, I dialogue with the daimon in me, because the daimon can kill you if you just allow the impersonal to flow through you. You literally starve to death. So you have to have not bargaining, but a kind of dialogue with the daimon. Say, look, I would do your bidding, but I need to make sure that that I have the means to do your bidding. So I have to worry about myself a little bit as well. But I find myself for years now, the entire second half of my life, allowing my life to be entirely driven by the daimon. For instance, having this conversation with you as a philosopher is a daimonic thing. What I want to do is be playing with my old computers. That's what the individual in me wants to do. I don't want to write a book. Every book has been a pain, 12 of them, 12 pains, like gestation and delivery. I don't want to do any of this stuff, man. It's these are choices. I hesitate.
You didn't just say you did something you didn't want to do, did you?
Most of what I do are things I don't want to do if I consider only myself.
Yeah.
But when the will of the daimon expresses itself through me because I open the gate, then I experience that will as my own. I feel the will, the impetus from a first person perspective. The only reason I know it's not mine is that it doesn't give a damn about me. It's not worried whether I have money to pay health insurance next month. It couldn't give less of a damn about it. And when it flows through me and I experience it, I know that it doesn't give a damn about me because I experience it from a first person perspective. I feel the want. I feel that will that doesn't give a damn about me. But I still feel it. I still feel the impetus. So that's why conceptually I still call it a want. It is a want. But in my inner dialogue, I separate it, just like you do. But I only do that in my inner dialogue, not as part of a metaphysical system. In my inner dialogue, I label it the daimon. That's the daimon feeling through me, and I get to have a first person perspective into that, as if it were me. Think of it as if you were a perfect telepath and you could experience everything somebody else experiences. You would still know that's not you. You would feel the will, you would feel the fear, you would feel the love, you would feel the perceptions, but you would know it's not you. So is the daimon. I feel it from a first person perspective as if it were me, but I know it's not. When I feel it, I go, oh, this shit is not me. This is the impersonal in nature, which is perfectly natural. We are products of nature. Of course, the impersonal ebb and flows through us. We didn't parachute in here. We are created by the impersonal. So I'm saying this because I want to convey to you that I completely understand the impulse to split the categories here. I do it in my inner dialogue as well, so I understand the impulse. It's just that conceptually, and now it's rationality, I find that there are stronger reasons to keep it as a spectrum than to split the categories, because it might lead to the misunderstanding or the misconception that it doesn't have an impetus behind it. It does. It does. There is an impetus to action. People who are selfless and even self-destructive experience this impetus to action that is not individual at all, and sometimes they can't help it. They are possessed by the daimon, so to say. Jung studied it a lot.
Okay, all right. So, one thing you said though was that if you could telepathically have complete access to someone's mind, you'd still know it wasn't you. So isn't that then where we get the reality of agency? In that the difference between your body moving and doing things and you don't think you are contributing to that, or you're not the source of that, it's something channeling through you, compared to when you are the source?
I would think of it more as the basis to define individuality, not necessarily agency. Because again, I feel the will from a first person perspective. I am the agent of the impersonal too, as far as my experience of it. It's not from a third person perspective or even a second person perspective. I feel the daimon's feelings. I feel the daimon's will. But the definition of individuality can rest on that, because the reason I would know if I were a perfect telepath, the reason I would know which thoughts are mine and which ones are yours has to do with the continuity and consistency with the narrative self. I am that person born on that day who does this for a living, who has this personality type, and married with that other person. And certain contents of experience would not fit that narrative, and therefore I would know they are not mine as an individual. They are yours. And I would know which ones fit the narrative and therefore are mine as an individual. But as far as agency, as you know, I think there is only one agent. It's core subjectivity. It's the mind of God, if you will. And that's the subjectivity in us, in you, and everybody, and in every animal, every plant. So I think agency doesn't. It's the narrative self, and therefore the notion of individual agency, yes, because insofar as it's attached to the narrative self, you could define individual agency that way. But agency unqualified, I never see it as individual. because I experienced the daimon directly. You know, if I want to romanticize it, sometimes I feel the will of God flowing through me. Like, most of the times these days now, it's so the notion of individual free will is so remote from me these days. It's like it's vanishing, makes you feel very tiny. But at the same time, insofar as you do identify with the impersonal, now you feel gigantic. You feel you are the entire universe. And these two things go hand in hand. As the individual agency starts shrinking and disappearing, there is something else that grows massively, but it's not individual. It's not conducive at all to having the feeling that you made a contribution. The very notion of, oh, I need to make a contribution, it disappears. There isn't the you there to make the contribution. There is the system running. Yeah, no, I can't defend this very well because now I'm getting too much into my own personal experience and things that I don't know how to defend and articulate.
Yeah, so you and I express things differently, and so it takes a little while for us to work out whether there is any genuine disagreement, what it might hinge around. But certainly, if what you're calling the daimon is also what you might, in other circumstances, call the will of God, it would certainly be unusual to say the will of God doesn't give a damn about me, as you sort of said before, or that. See, so
I don't think it does.
Okay, so I think, again, if I were to use religious language, this I think is the mystery of morality that is expressed in John's gospel, with the idea of to find you, those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. And it seems like you're talking about something in this territory,
yeah,
which I would agree with. The more we try to hold on to ourselves in a way to distinguish ourselves from others, make our mark, the kind of thing you do as a teenager where you want to get tattoos so you upset your parents and all this sort of stuff. You want to try and distance yourself from anything else and be you, this sort of modern command, just be yourself, no one else is like you, you're special, blah, 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 all of that stuff. That's not freedom, that is complete and utter slavery to yourself. And I think the same thing when we're driven by our overwhelming personal desires, our ego, our need to be recognized, and all of that kind of stuff. I think we're probably completely agreed there. Where I would describe it differently, though, is when you feel caught up in something bigger than yourself, and you feel as though you have certain capacities that go beyond what would naturally be you. You experience on the one level a loss or a death of the ego or the self, but you experience out the other end a kind of resurrection or new life or eternal will, in which you are not completely lost. Your role or contribution or part is maintained, but in new form, in a way that there's unity, but not an erasure of relationship. No, this is not very philosophical language now, but it's really hard to, because we're now talking about things at the level of the absolute or universal consciousness. I think, and this is something that is best understood in terms of love, I think, or pure love. What happens when you're purely in love? There is a sense in which you lose yourself in the other, because your attention and your focus shifts from yourself into the other, and there is a becoming one. But that unity and that becoming one is not an erasure of the difference or erasure of the two-ness that's present. It's something whereby you recognize your contribution or your role in the relationship. You recognize that you have the capacity to ruin everything, and that what the state that you're in has certain fragility to it, wonderment to it, and in some sense is bigger than you, and it's not all about you anymore. I mean, you get this when you're in love, when you get married, you get it when you're holding a baby in your arms. And I know you don't have any children, but I can tell you, when you have a kid and you first hold it, then your world changes. It's not about you anymore, right? Even more so than when you get married. When you get married, it's not about you. When you have kids, it's definitely not about you. And all of that stuff, there can be a modern impulse, and maybe it's come from sort of progressivism and some sort of feminist thought, to think there's something bad about this and there's something diminishing that is experienced and you're being oppressed or suppressed. Just haven't felt it that way at all. For me, it is where the freedom is in being caught up in something bigger. But I certainly don't feel as though that sort of doesn't give a damn about me, or I'm losing. It's a sort of a both and thing. You're both lost in it, and you find yourself in it more truly than you thought you would.
Yeah, but you see, when that which has never existed dies, nothing is lost. That's the recognition. The death of that which has never existed is no loss. And I don't think God cares about that which has never existed. You see what I mean?
Yeah, so God doesn't care about your finitude or your earthly.
It doesn't care about our narrative constructs, because they're just that, thoughts in the mind of God, not real entities.
So maybe I should put it this way then. Would you say the daimon, or mind at large, loves you in the way that I was
love that which doesn't exist, that which is just a configuration, a useful configuration, a tool, a means to an end.
So do you have a sort of...
Do I love a fist? A fist is not a thing. Otherwise, the thing would have disappeared and should have caused, a black hole in the process of disappearing. Do I love the fist? No, the fist doesn't exist. It's a configuration. It's a doing. It's a means to an end, to point something. In the same way, the narrative personal self, it's a fist. It never existed. It's a configuration. It's a doing.
I haven't, my interest has been metaphysics, so I've been interested more in the truth side, the logic side, and causation bits and pieces, not so much in trying to explain. But maybe I've mentioned Parmenides to you before, and I like the Parmenidean understanding, but I certainly wouldn't go to the point. My monism is not of the complete homogeneity that you get in Parmenides.
Diversity,
That where there's just the all well-rounded, equal in every direction, the same here as there.
Neither is mine. Look, there is a fist, there is a fist, there is a fist, there is another fist, there is a fist, a fist. There are many fists, countless, infinite. And they are all doings. They are all configurations, patterns of excitation.
Yeah, okay. I'm still not sure whether we're in complete agreement or not. We certainly describe things differently, which is fine, and this is a helpful.
But what I was trying to do earlier is, because I said at some point, the daimon or the impersonal doesn't give a damn about me, and you said, well, I don't see that happening. I think even though you're subsumed into something greater, there's still love towards you, and that's what I was trying to react to. I think the narrative self is a non-existent. It's a concept that has no substance, like the fist. It's a concept, but it's a configuration. It's not a thing. So is the individual self. It's a configuration. It's not a thing. It's not an entity, and therefore, I think, although it's comforting psychologically, I think it is as nonsensical or otherwise to speak of love for the fist as it is to think of love for my personal self. There is a vantage point from which things that don't exist cannot be loved. See what I mean?
Yeah.
You cannot care about things that don't exist. It's like saying, I care about my fist. I have to make sure my fist has a good life, and I don't want my fist to suffer. It's just a configuration. It comes and goes. It's a means to an end. It's part of a process.
True, I can see that, but that doesn't mean that love has to be only at the level of the whole. I mean, you can love a configuration in a way. I think. I mean, I certainly think I can love my sons, my love my wife, and
Maybe
so the only kind of grip I have on love involves a unity without erasure, and this is, I think, maybe where, as I said, I'm not a Hegelian. I don't think that at the end there's just thought. I don't think at the end. I don't think actually at the end there. It depends whether you consider me a monist or not. I don't think at the end there is ever. So you can't get to a conception really that is able to unite truth, beauty, and goodness. They're just reflective of different aspects of our feelings, our agency, our actions, and our thought. And yet we recognize they're not entirely separate. So I don't think there's any. I don't think I'm a substance. That, as in the old understanding of substance, as in capable of independent existence. No, there's only one substance, and that is the whole.
But you can love a configuration. Yeah.
Sorry?
But you can love a configuration of that substance.
Well, I think that the whole is not unitary. Is a unity, but it's not singular. That it is relational, although I'm hesitant to say that because I think they are. So I'm with Bradley on the idea of relations themselves as, if we're going to reify them, they're problematic.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is why, in some ways, the more I've done philosophy, and I think I've done it as honestly as I can, the previous head scratching about the notion of Trinity has now become, for me, the basis of it. It is the only mystery from which everything else makes sense, where you can have both unity and also relation.
It's probably the deepest dogma in the history of religious thought. Yeah. Look, I, as an individual that doesn't exist but seems to exist to me, I love fists. I love configurations. I love my girlfriend, my partner in life. When I said what I said from trying to take the perspective of God, because the motivation was when you said, but God loves me, or God loves people. And so that's why I said, from the perspective of God, these are just fists. So I'm not sure how much God can love a fist. But I, as a fist, love another fist, for sure. I love my girlfriend, and I love my cat. And yet, in my better days, I can intuit that which I love behind the eyes of my girlfriend goes way beyond my girlfriend. That which is right there looking at me from behind her eyes is not just her. It's the whole thing. And in loving her, I'm loving the whole thing, as expressed in her, as expressed in my cat. So my love for her and my cats in my better days has this felt understanding that they are not limited by the boundaries of their bodies. That which I love is not limited by the boundary of their bodies. But that's only my better days.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And, and that very much is with the Christian idea of, well, you can't love God if you don't love your brother. In the way in which you love God, the love of God is manifest in your love for your brother, and so on. And so that is, I think it's all coming around to that same kind of thing, in that free will is manifest in the capacity to recognize that you are finite and there is much more, and that what is much more has its own interests and wills and so on. And you can orient your actions around that. And that's, yeah. So I think that's probably very similar. So if I were to turn your view into a slogan, because sometimes when I've seen it, you've sort of said, there is no free will, but that's wonderful. And we can find meaning even though there's no free will. But in our conversation here, it seems like you're saying, there is free will. It's compatibilist from our point of view, and from the point of view of mind at large is just free will. I mean, how
Well,
would you sort of try to put it into a bumper sticker?
well, as you know, I don't get to choose the thumbnails and titles of videos.
Yeah, yeah,
So you're probably deriving that from some thumbnail or some title of a video, which I authorized because it was an Essential Foundation video, and I let the guy who runs our channel, use his knowledge and experience and do the best he can to give people a chance to look at our stuff. If you ask me, what's your position on free will, expecting sort of a quick answer back, um, and I'm restricted to only giving a quick answer, then I would say the whole question is a red herring. Because the only way to answer it properly is to take 10 minutes and elaborate on what I mean. And what are the definitions of free will? Which ones are tenable, which are not? What are the conclusions we can extract given each definition? And so on and so forth. It's not something I can say, well, I believe in free will or I don't believe. Well, I don't recognize this dichotomy. So it's difficult to give a quick answer. So my quick answer would be the whole thing is a red herring, even the question itself. Because one, I don't think fundamentally libertarian free will is there. But two, going forward to the future, everything happens as if it were. So what are we fretting about?
yeah. Well, I've actually already designed a thumbnail. Well, I didn't, but I said what I wanted done, and it's complicated coming out of your mouth, so it's probably an apt thumbnail. So yeah, well, thank you very much again, Bernardo. You're very generous with your time to me, and I think we have
With
very good
you, yeah,
conversations.
I'm turning down almost every interview invitation. I accept yours because it's not an interview.
Yeah,
It's a conversation, and I'm always up for conversations. But interviews, it's like, what? How can I answer the same question in a different way?
yeah,
Again,
yeah.
and I'm sufficiently busy with all the activities I have going. But I'm happy to always come back and have a conversation with you.
Wonderful. Well, that I'm even more appreciative in that case. So thanks again for coming and for spending so long. And it's been insightful and great. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Bye.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure, Nathan.